Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We are excited to have you and to be having our first event of 2023. So, hello to all. Thank you for your time today. I am just going to give folks a minute or two past the hour to be able to join, but we are excited to have you all. I think today we'll have a wonderful event. Oh, and I love people feel comfortable going on camera and
The best.
people's faces. Yeah, you never really know. And so we tend to have a mix. And so I'm so glad to see folks on camera. And as I'll mention when I get fully into our intro here, we are going to have an opportunity for Q&A to be able to have a bit of discussion and dialogue. And so for sure, folks should feel free to come off or come on camera and ask their questions. We can also use the chat function as well, but it's kind of nice to be able to have some interaction with the speakers, and they would enjoy it as well. So you can feel free.
Absolutely. And I will just add that we're here as sort of, thought leaders in this space, but I would love to hear anyone's ideas or things that they're doing in their organizations related to the topic. So please jump in at any time.
Very much a learning and growth mindset that we bring to this topic, but I would say that that's probably very prevalent in our community as well for folks that are interested in this topic, but also part of our broader community. So, let me see. Maybe I'll just go ahead and start with my my slides, and I'm sure we'll have some more folks that are going to be joining as we get underway. But I also want to make sure that we have plenty of time for the wonderful content that Kiera and Bria have prepared for us today, and then be able to get into the dialogue. And so what I'm going to do is just share my screen briefly while I kind of give us a little bit of an opening here. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to our speakers for today. So thank you all for joining Cultural Appreciation at Work. This is our first event of 2023, as I mentioned, and I think this will be a really good one. So I'm excited that you're joining us today. I'd like to start these events just as a reminder for folks that have heard this before, but as a new information. If this is the first Conscious Capitalism Boston event that you are joining us for, if that's the case, welcome. And the Boston chapter's purpose that we have had in place since we were founded 6 or 7 years ago at this point is to connect, educate, and inspire leaders and workers to consciously build businesses that positively impact the world. And our vision is we will foster the fundamental transformation of capitalism to a healthy, balanced way of doing business for all people and the planet. And then I always like to take a moment to say thank you and highlight our corporate members of the chapter. We're very grateful for our corporate members, and this list is growing. This morning, I was adding our very newest members to this list, Green City Growers and CK, which is Clandestine Kitchen, are brand new corporate members of our chapter. And so thanks to them and to all of our corporate members who continue to collaborate in our community as well as support the chapter. And for our agenda today, it's pretty simple. So I'm gonna wrap up my my portion of the introduction and give you fuller introductions to our two speakers, and then I will pass the mic over to them for the presentation that they've prepared for us, and then we're going to go into Q&A. And so we should be able to have some good time for being able to address any questions, and as Kiera said, be able to actually hear some of your experiences as well, because this is very much considered a learning environment for all of us. And so with that, I am going to then just officially introduce our two speakers today. So we have Dr. Kiera Penpedji. She's an organizational and leadership psychologist with experience in multiple arenas, including nonprofit, higher ed, and high tech. The focus of her work is developing diversifying organizations to improve the quality of their practices, to increase the sense of belonging, and to prime them to operate with diversity, equity, and inclusion in mind. Kiera spent about a decade in both HR and organizational development. Most recently, she founded Prime OD to provide OD and DEI consulting, where she can leverage her knowledge of people systems to coach, advise, facilitate, and assess a broad range of organizations, from small nonprofits all the way to large multinational corporations. And then finally, she's an educator who brings an academic approach to her work in the field, and she teaches courses related to organizational development, multicultural competence, and inclusive leadership right here in Newton at the William James College. And thanks to Kiera, I was introduced, and today you are being introduced to Bria Gambrell. She is the manager of talent and culture at Giffords. Her experience spans working with various nonprofits as well as in the government space. She has provided consulting to colleges and universities on issues of racial equity and racial justice. And with her people first approach, Bria seeks to curate intentional spaces for Black and Brown staff to show up as themselves in their whole and authentic way, and to be able to thrive. Bria previously resided in Boston, though she is coming to us today from her home for the last few years in Dallas. And so with that, I am going to pass the mic over to Kiera and Bria.
Thank you. And I'm so excited to see a student here, some people from my network. It's so great to be with you, and I hope to hear your voices as you sort of share your experiences. And I think it's really good to be having this conversation, among those who champion organizational inclusion, and doing so at the start of the year, and just a few days before Black History Month. Because we've got a lot to celebrate throughout the year, and hopefully this will help set the stage for how we do that in an equitable and inclusive way. In honor of Black History Month, we'll be using a lot of examples from the Black experience, though we'll also include reflections of the experiences of different oppressed groups within our society. So as Kelly shared, I've been in the people space for many years, and in these recent years, it's clear how the pandemic has increased the boiling point from the dissatisfaction that was sort of already simmering when it came to employee engagement. And we see this result reflected in, the Great Resignation, increased challenges recruiting, as job seekers, they really have more options than ever, as more companies move to remote status. So I'm going to show some data, and I have a few slides for you, or we have a few slides for you throughout the session, but I just want to show some recent data from 2020. This is from McKinsey. They did a study on inclusion that reflects the demographics who are more likely to turn down a job because of perceived lack of inclusion. So you can see that generally the average of 39% of that perception is quite high. 39% of people perceiving lack of inclusion. That's almost half of job seekers who care about inclusion, no matter how they identify. But it comes as no surprise, based on this slide, that women, historically marginalized races and ethnicities, those who identify as LGBTQ+, report turning down a job based on perceptions of inclusion more so. So according to the study, and I'm happy to share the link in a bit too, it's really easy to find, McKinsey Inclusion 2020. But according to the study, the 4 factors that respondents linked to this sense of inclusion was diverse and inclusive leadership, so representation, meritocracy, like actual meritocracy, not just talking about it, but doing it, and the initiatives to increase fairness, sponsorship from 1 or more people, and access to senior leaders. So these respondents, according to the study, they more than somewhat agreed that their organizations were inclusive, that they feel like they belong, and that they're comfortable, raising their opinions and ideas without fear of repercussions, and they're able to be themselves, So, to accomplish this sentiment is why we're here. Within organizations, we must help employees, no matter their background, feel seen and heard. And that starts by recognizing who they are, recognizing their cultures and the value that they're bringing in. So I'm looking forward to hearing some of Bria's thoughts. But, as I reflect on, how do we recognize, in my time as head of DEI at a tech company who was really starting systemic inclusion for the first time, it was really challenging to get ahead of every cultural holiday, every observance. And considering that I was the sole person responsible for DEI, and I know many of us kind of take that role formally or informally in our organizations. If I spent time organizing events and content all day, I wouldn't be able to, pay attention to like the talent acquisition process I was working on, other systems to create equity, the real stuff that impacts mobility within organizations. So I was lucky to work at a company where employees were incredibly vocal about DEI, very young. It was like mostly Gen Z, Gen Y. And once we had a strategy in place, I was able to communicate the actions that I was taking. For example, I put out an announcement that we wanted to support different identity groups with time, attention, and budget. And the call to action for folks was to reach out with interest in creating affinity groups. In other words, groups that were, had shared identities where they were able to find each other and relate. So, I was in close contact with those leaders, the leaders of those groups, who helped build awareness of the issues and events that they, that their demographic cared about. But I also, took the responsibility to make suggestions, based on my own research, based on my own, best practices. So multiple eyes on, what's important, what might be important. At the same time, no Black employees raised their hands to create a group. And it was well known within the organization that Black employees were the ones leaving, and we were having a tough time recruiting Black employees to begin with. So it was really important to focus my energy where the data suggested there needs to be more attention. So I'm Black myself, that's one reason I would care, right? But I also, as the head of DEI, realized that if there's no one individual or group that was specifically creating the conditions for inclusion for those who weren't experiencing it, then it was my job, right? So they needed that representative. So I want to hear from Bria too, your perspectives on this. So, tell me what your successes or lack thereof that you've seen when it comes to recognizing cultural groups.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you all so much for taking your time today and being here with us. I'm going to start with my failure first, because I think I should just acknowledge that I have been in places and I've worked in different organizations and government entities and agencies where I have failed. And that failure is not, my exact just mine to hold, but rather the organization's failure to Black and brown folks in the organization. And so at one point in time, I worked for a smaller city here in Texas, and I was the sole DEI person as well, just like UKR. And it was my sole responsibility to create the conditions in which we wanted to have our staff and employees thrive for a city of over 900 staff members, or with 900 staff members, I should say. It was very, very challenging. And there were opportunities for us to reach out and talk to folks. But then we didn't have affinity groups. We didn't have people wanting to start affinity groups because they just weren't sure how it was going to be accepted into the workplace. And like, can we meet during work hours? Do we have to meet after work hours? And that feels like a happy hour. I'm not getting paid for my time, all the things. And I actually took a hard failure at that one because I was not able to start those affinity groups or be able to really help folks thrive in the space in which they wanted to in that organization. On the other hand of that, though, in the same organization, we were able to meet with communities that were severely underrepresented in the city. And I know I'm coming from a little bit of a different perspective here rather than like a whole organization. This is a whole city in Texas, in a way that staff members felt like they could find community there as well. And so that was really helpful. And that was a really helpful experience for me, and finding ways in which to bring, the cultural appreciation up front for us. Instead of creating it within, we can go out and figure out what works best for staff members. And that was one minor success at a very large city with lots of different failures.
Yeah, and it's ongoing, right? And I think normalizing the, I don't want to, like, failures is such a strong word, but
Right.
the hurdles, the barriers towards success along the way, I think helps people stay encouraged and motivated, toward those, those small wins. And those small wins should certainly be celebrated, because this is like ongoing work, especially if we have got organizations who are doing this for the first time. Like, we need to celebrate those small wins and make them very visible so that people can see, okay, those actions we're taking, that budget we're spending is actually making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Did you want to add something?
No, I was going to say we did do a similar study to the one that you're showing on the screen by McKinsey, and it was very similar. Again, we had over 900 staff members, and about a little shy of 40% of those staff were folks who identified as people of color. I'm also a Black woman, as I would have submitted into the survey as well. And a lot of folks responded with very, very similar results on this survey, saying that they would love to see leadership that not only reflects their values, but literally looks like them they have access to. And I know you had mentioned sponsorship. We had a large majority across the board, diverse populations, say that they were interested in mentorship. And so that was another opportunity in which we could have grown that, again, the hurdle, right? So not a complete failure, but it's a hurdle that we have to figure out how to navigate, figure out how to jump over, and figure out how to make it more accessible for all of the staff to have those opportunities for mentorship and sponsorship.
Absolutely. And those things really help create visibility. So, if the ultimate goal is, progression within the organization, how do we highlight those who are not part of the majority, who are maybe like the extroverted and have the sexy jobs like sales and, are close to the product. And, I love what you're sharing there in that respect. So. Another important call out that I think we should mention is how we match our actions with our words. And I've been a part of people teams, who certainly cared about, the various cultures within the organization, but we didn't always do enough to ensure that our infrastructure was built in ways that included. One example is, our very Christian society, right? Christianity is the dominant culture in our society. It's reflected in, the list of holidays that we offer time off for. So I have just too many times have seen, Jewish holidays be consistently overlooked. To points where, like, huge company events being scheduled on those dates. This is actually a good time to remind everyone today's the Holocaust Day of Remembrance. So let's keep that in mind today too, as we're acknowledging those within our workplaces. But I know many organizations are beginning to radicalize time off by offering unlimited time off. So we're seeing that more and more. And it's a good thing. I know, we get some benefits. We sort of remove that financial liability, right? Because we don't have to pay out all that PTO time. So there's that component of it. But it also allows employees to decide based on their cultures which days they want to observe. So with that said, a company choosing to observe, certain cultural events also sends a strong message. So we saw many organizations, sort of walk the talk, at the, in 2020, after the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, and, the increased momentum towards social justice, especially within organizations. And companies started, observing Juneteenth even before it became a federal holiday. So that was just an example of how, that would have impacted. I mean, I saw that impact at the organization that I worked, Black employees like really feeling, okay, like they're going to take a hit, we're closed, we're not going to make any money that day. So it really showed this company cares. So Bree, I'm curious, from your perspective, what policies and practices have you sort of seen built around cultural celebrations?
Yeah. This is actually something we talk about at Giffords lately, or that we've been talking about at Giffords lately. And I think from when I first joined, my first question was, okay, where's like our staff holiday list? Like what days do staff get off? And we just follow exactly the whatever government holidays, federal holidays there are. But also we've implemented like a substantial amount of PTO room for folks who, like you were mentioning, Kiara, like celebrate a lot of Jewish holidays. And people can take those days off as they feel necessary and needed. But I've also worked in places in which that was not an option. Or there was the whole, oh, we're going to close for Juneteenth now. And again, going back to the city example, we're going to close for Juneteenth, but our street workers are still going to be working. Okay, well, majority of our street workers or street cleaners, I'm sorry, I don't want to say street workers, street cleaners are Black and brown folks. So who's really getting the benefit of taking Juneteenth off here? And we had to like actually have a conversation, a question what this looks like in practice. And so one thing that I think a lot of different organizations can start doing, in addition to, the unlimited PTO, which I'm a personal fan of, is also recognizing on just like their calendars, like their own work calendars. It doesn't have to be a day in which folks have off across the organization, but putting it on the calendar that these are days that are important to a lot of our staff members. These are religious holidays that maybe we as an entity don't recognize or observe, but our staff do observe. And we want to make sure that we're honoring the space for them to continue observing that in the organization without feeling as though they're being called out or not, or their religious identity is not being recognized here. So I think like those type of policies and practices are ones that really make me excited, because it feels as though, okay, we're taking one small step in the right direction, but it feels very loud and noticeable for folks who might have felt like they've had to be really quiet about their religious identities previously.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and that example, very vivid example of those who should be benefiting from Juneteenth, still working. That sort of that's a good example of the intent versus impact. So how much do we think about how the impact of this new offering will be? And my favorite thing about what you're sharing, about practices or policies is, just the calendar, adding cultural celebrations of observances to the holidays, considering we can't observe everything. We can't, physically create an internal event or have the day off or what have you, but, offering that awareness is a step. And it just makes me think about when deciding, what to observe. First of all, iterating as we go, I think is really important as our organizations diversify and change, but we should learn about who's in our organization. Like, do we have, a significant percentage of Jewish, people, or a significant percentage of, Latino, Latinx? What can we do to make the actual people who we represent, who are here, feel welcome and included? So thank you for that. It's really helpful. And I would say too, a good place to start is to, focus on internal actions versus, how these things look externally, because I think that's often a pitfall too. We care about attracting talent. But as I always say, they're going to find out, they're going to come in and find out what it's really like in the organization. So while it may take a while to reap the benefits of talent acquisition, we want to really create a sentiment of inclusion by focusing on what the needs are internally first before sharing. And then eventually, just have the outside match the inside. So what does it feel like internally? How can we sort of reflect that experience externally so that people can actually see what it's like? So that's another thing that I'll add there. So there is sort of an opposite of appreciation, which is appropriation, which I don't think we talk enough about in the organizational context.
And we don't want to be called out.
What's that?
I was saying, well, we don't want to be called out. We can't talk about it
Right.
all the time.
I know, exactly. I actually recently created a workshop on the topic. And I was really happy to see, not surprised, to see that, an organization would be looking to learn about that, especially if they're, a digital focused organization. But just to sort of define appropriation, it's the adoption or exploitation of a culture by a more dominant culture. So it makes sense, based on this digital age where appropriation is beginning to manifest in more subtle ways. So if you think of TikTok, the voiceovers, with people using, there's another, it's African-American vernacular. I don't know if you've heard that term. I haven't heard it until recently, what we used to call ebonics, right? Sort of taking those voiceovers and like having someone in a dominant culture just sort of, steal that, or, we call it sort of digital blackface, right? So there's a few articles out there, explaining the idea of digital blackface and, this country's history of minority groups and those in power, taking from Black creators and sort of posing these ideas as their own. It's taking on a new life, right? And it's more subtle because we're doing that with every voice, right? All the voice, that's the whole point, right? Is to take a voice that someone else created and, make it their own. But then when we start to move away from the original intent and the stories and backgrounds for why someone created that, that's when it becomes, suspicious, right? So, we've seen this happen a lot in the past, where it comes to, music, right? Hip hop and R&B sometimes get created by, Black community, takes on a new life.
Hi, this is Sue.
The original.
Hi, Erin, how are you?
Oh, and I hear someone speaking. You probably just want to mute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I wanted to show an example on this next slide. I didn't realize I had the slide share happening. So very loud, lots of colors. But this slide shows other examples of socially accepted appropriation. We've got Gwen Stefani, upper right corner, appropriating Japanese culture. Adele on the right, upper right. This one particularly hurts. Adele, come on, we expected more from you. But appropriating Jamaican culture, the Bantu Natsu African culture, Vanessa Hudgens on the bottom left, the Bindi, sort of borrowing that from Indian culture, and then Justin Bieber, the indigenous Indian and African cultures where, dreadlocks began. So reflecting on, sort of applying this to the workplace, we might want to, for example, celebrate Cinco de Mayo. And this is just like an easy example. I'm sure you can all think of, many examples that are similar. And we're like, okay, we got to celebrate. Let's get some sombreros and mustaches and maracas, or it's Diwali. So let's order some Indian food and watch a Bollywood movie together. So, these elements are culturally appropriate, but they're just artifacts of the cultures we want to celebrate. They're not meaningful, however, without really getting to the true intention of the celebration. And so, I'm just going to take this down. It's very distracting. But one way I have seen cultural appropriation, appreciation, was actually from an Indian woman in an organization and she was responding to my CTA about, that I mentioned earlier about, we have a budget for you, please, if you're willing and open, we'd love to create the space for, those with a shared identity. So she reached out and she volunteered from her group their time to teach those interested in the history of Bollywood dancing, which was a combination of various traditional Indian dance styles. So there's 3 or 4 different traditional styles that you'll see reflected in Bollywood movies. So it's not called Bollywood dancing, but that's what it represents. And then she had us join her for a dance lesson. And so it was authentic. We created the conditions for her to share her culture without forcing it, letting her volunteer it. And then, the samosas, those were just sort of icing on the cake. And so, sometimes it takes sort of the efforts of, those willing to share, head of DEI, I wouldn't be able to do that. And I shouldn't do that, right? That doesn't come from my culture. But that was one way that we were able to sort of bring up the cultures that existed already. So Bria, I would love to hear your specific take on appreciation versus appropriation and any examples that you have from your past.
Yes. I'm smiling because the Gwen Stefani one really got me most recently. I don't know if anyone saw that the tweets going around, her recent, I don't want to call it an expose, but she was interviewed recently and asked, do you regret, appropriating culture? And she was like, no, this is still my culture because I did it. And it is a very wild take to, sorry, my dog's shaking. It's a very wild take to have, especially in post 2020 and the awakening, I'm putting air quotes around that. And you would think that folks would want to be better about that, but I guess Gwen Stefani just puts herself ahead of and higher than other folks, but that's okay. I think that is one thing that is just, it's not helpful to anyone, but I think also when I was working in Massachusetts, for an agency out there, we did a movie screening. We really wanted to make it an educational opportunity for staff to watch the new Dolores Huerta film, but also bring in other perspectives, because as the 2 Black women, myself and my mentor at the organization, we couldn't be the people who were sharing how to best recognize Mexican heritage, and so we worked with an outside organization who were able to come in and show the film screening. So they showed it with us. We did a Q&A. They had the director on a Zoom call. It was really, really engaging an opportunity. And it was helpful for a lot of our staff who don't have the background or the experience or lived experience of being Mexican American. And so, and of course, the labor union of itself in the film was really engaging for a lot of our staff who do that work front lines. And so we were able to host that. And then I was also thinking about an opportunity for during really important days. I'm thinking about the most, we're still, a lot of folks are still celebrating the Lunar New Year, and ways in which we can engage with staff to see if that's of interest to anyone, if they want to explore ways in which we can better appreciate Chinese American and different Asian cultures in general. And I'm saying Chinese American because it's the most the largest number of people in our organization, at least, who celebrate Lunar New Year, but everyone's organization can be different. And in this conversation, we were able to kind of chat with different folks across the organization who actually didn't want to celebrate Lunar New Year within the organization. They rather keep that private and to themselves, and saving space for people to just celebrate the way they want to celebrate. We don't have to put anything out front, outside. We don't have to do that. But if we're going to provide the space, we want to do it authentically. And I think that's the emphasis for me.
Love that. Yes. And as I think about, what we can sort of leverage from that, from letting people, celebrate in the way that they want to, or maybe, someone like the employee that I mentioned earlier who, volunteered her time to teach us dance, is, okay, this is one way to do it. And so now we know, and, without burdening the same people over and over again, or burdening those who, aren't part of the majority to educate all the time, how can we use our resources to find outside people to do what feels authentic and appropriate, right? As long as they align with their values and as long as, people, are interested in engaging in those things. So thank you for that. Thanks for sharing. Before we move on to the next section, there's another way to think about appreciation versus appropriation. And there is a cultural theorist and educator, Kanye Kawasaki, absolutely different Kanye, who suggested that there are 3 elements to consider when navigating culture. And those are property. So what group created the cultural artifact is the question. Privilege, is it a dominant group that is using that artifact from a subordinated group? And 3, profit, is that dominant group benefiting from using this artifact with social capital, money, or power? So these 3 questions are a helpful way to consider intentions around cultural celebrations. And just sort of say it simply, we don't want to see a dominant group taking someone else's property and benefiting from it. So let's think about ways that we can use these, have these artifacts represented by those they belong to, as Bria was, suggesting, and that only benefit their felt inclusion, right? So there's no, it's not about, how we can, post this externally so that it can attract talent, but just thinking about the felt experience of those who are already within our walls. All right, so I'm going to speed up a little bit because I do want to make sure we can hear from you all. Another way to engage in cultural appreciation is to think about how we're honoring and recognizing those cultures. So using Black History Month as an example, we have a history of celebrating the Black elite, the major players in our history, like scholars and inventors, which is great, but we are not a monolith. We are not all scholars and inventors. Some of us are just regular people in our industries making an impact, doing things that shift the culture. Or we might use, Black History Month as a way to, remind people of our country's violent past against, Black people. But just doing those 2 things leaves so much opportunity on the table. So what I've been urging individuals and employers to do is focus both on honoring the past, but also thinking about creating a better future. So again, Black History Month is upon us in just a couple of days. Carter G. Woodson, the pioneer of Black History Month, said, this is a quote, if a race has no history, if it has no worthwhile tradition, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated. So the same holds true, I would say, for many, historically marginalized groups in present day. To not acknowledge their history is to ignore their oppression that has pervaded their existence today, the lived experience today. So it's crucial to honor the past and create a better future. And what I mean by that is, celebrating the people responsible for progress and creating a path for their people, while also maintaining efforts to change the systems and the institutions and the ideologies that, sort of perpetuate that oppression. At one company, and we'll sort of moving away from the Black History Month example, at one company, that meant celebrating Pride Month by changing all the screens in our conference room, but doing so around the globe. So, there was an LGBTQ plus affinity group, and, they worked as a sort of more of an employee resource group. So they had tasks, because it wasn't just about relating to each other and bonding, but, more about bringing awareness and learning to the organization. So what we decided to do, and this was actually a group that I created, and I was really proud of that, that actually propelled me into the DEI field. So really, really love reflecting on that time. But what we did with the screens, and these are like huge TVs in each conference room all over the globe, was showed the face of a lesser known advocate for trans lives. And, And that's the group within the LGBTQ plus demographic that we knew were being threatened more than ever, and therefore needed more support. And at the same time, we created info cards that we placed on employees' desks with facts and statistics about trans lives. So we were also educating. So it was like awareness and education. And some of those things were celebratory as well. So, we really tried to use the resources we had. Didn't cost much. It just, what it cost was collaboration across different departments, and it made a huge impact globally. So Bree, I would love to hear some examples from your world when it comes to expanding the ways in which we celebrate. So how we do it.
Yeah, very similar to yours, except I wish I could get like a screen share across all the different countries in which we would have worked at that time. No, so I worked with an agency in Massachusetts, and it's really interesting because I think in 2020 and even in 2019 at the time, people were really having this conversation about the attack on trans lives that you were just mentioning. But like how we can talk about the history while also amplifying the joy, as you said as well. And the way in which we did that was it was interesting because we tried to provide a space in which we had, I'm just gonna name it. I worked for Mass Now, and we helped create I'm sorry, that is not the word. We started working with the Transgender Emergency Fund. And so we were able to have this conversation. We're like, what is our history? But at the same time, like, where are we headed now? And the progress in which we are all making individually. Like, yes, we are working in this agency collectively, but what are we doing in our own community spaces as well? Because people are showing up here at work and in these, like, again, small, intimate community spaces in an organization where we're putting on our corporate face, we're putting on our at times white America corporate faces and corporate voices. And so what are we doing outside of that? And how can we bring joy and amplify that work as well? And so we started doing this thing at Mass Now where we would highlight a board member, we would highlight a member in general, and just talk about their day-to-day, like what are they doing in their world. And it was actually a really fun opportunity for us to also just get to know a lot of the members that at the time we didn't know everyone who was a member of the organization. And it was so fun because we were able to connect folks who probably didn't know that someone lived in their area, in their region. And at the same time, we were also able to connect organizations. So if we heard that someone worked for a state entity, like a legal aid organization, hypothetically, and someone else also worked in the same industry, they were able to make those connections because of their personal work that they've done outside of that work. So it was really fun. And I think we can probably do stuff like that all the time in different organizations and different corporations if that in which we work. And I think it was a success and something that I hope to continue doing in my personal life as well.
Yeah, that's great. And then you sort of bolstered those folks, giving them visibility, which hopefully, had further impact on their lives. So I love hearing that. And I'm going to share one of our last slides here as we get toward our Q&A. I wanted to offer some additional ways to hold space, both for the past and the future. So I'll sort of go through each of these with examples, but we can seek a parallel understanding of the experiences of different identity groups and history as we already grew to understand it or learned it. An example, Black History Month as an example, American history parallels Black history. So it's just that American history, as we were taught, doesn't often acknowledge what, Black people were up to, what was going on for us back then. So I was blown away, one Black History Month, and maybe some folks knew this, definitely not my school, we didn't cover this. But I was blown away to learn that in 1967, 64% of eligible Black Americans were drafted into the Vietnam War in comparison to 31% of eligible whites. And so, I knew that Black people took space, at the front lines so that they were targeted first, right, during those battles. But I didn't know that they dominated the ranks, so not much recognition for that huge contribution, the amount of bodies that were actually represented. So just an example of like, what is using, that cultural opportunity to, share some things that sort of got buried as, our education system decided what was important to highlight. Going beyond highlighting the trauma, and Bria spoke to this a moment ago, highlighting the trauma experienced by, people, maybe examples like, doom scrolling stories, resharing videos of brutality, sort of re-traumatizing people with the reminder that these things are still happening, and there's no end in sight, but instead creating a balance of educating those who need awareness while also advocating for what can be done, and the happy stories that obviously exist in parallel to that trauma. We have to keep going, right? Just because we're part of a marginalized group doesn't mean it's top of mind for us all the time. In fact, we want to be able to cope while also, receiving the benefits that those who aren't from those groups are able to benefit from on a day-to-day basis. We can start to transition from listening and learning as an action toward, the individual impact that we can make. So many of us are in the practice of talking about identity, personally maybe, but also sometimes professionally for the first time. And that's okay. We're all at different stages of advocacy, but listening and learning can't be our default forever. So let's think about how we can mobilize within the boundaries of our organizations. And this could be pointing out deficits for certain groups, but we'll also, making suggestions for how to bolster visibility, because there are great things that are happening. Let's highlight and create visibility for those things that are happening that aren't getting recognized. And that's the stuff that matters for, I think every employee can say they want opportunities and advancement, right? They don't just want to skate by. So that sponsorship, that bolstering of what's what people are contributing and bringing is another way to think about it. And in the meantime, I would say, one simple action that we can all take is to support the successes of historically marginalized groups in a country where systems were built to, prevent that success. And we can do that by, using our money where our mouth is, right? So buying from, their businesses, referring them for open roles at the organization, going out of your way to do so. Harnessing a genuine interest in their scholars, their influencers, their activists, their entertainers, like what books you're reading, how you're spending your free time. And so I want to see if, Bree, you had anything to add to that. But I would love to hear from you all, what other ideas that you have swirling around. So Bria, anything to add to that topic, that part of our conversation?
No, the only thing I'll mention is on that last bullet point, it says to buy from, hire, and learn from historically marginalized groups for justice, not just pity, and not pity, period, is when you're thinking about professional development for your teams, for your staff members, think about who you're working with. Think about who are they serving? What do their demographics look like? And then what resources are they providing? And working and developing our professional development education over here at Giffords, I send everyone a book by Adrienne Marie Brown, slight plug, sorry. And that's their first really introduction to some of that work. And from there, growing folks' knowledge base and understanding that the content knowledge is not going to come overnight and no one's going to share it all collectively without that communication. And so if you provide maybe a base in which to start. So let's use this Adrienne Marie Brown book as a base in which to start. And then you start having conversations and those talk and learnings that Kiara was mentioning, and then really start challenging the implicit, right? Challenging the impacts that we could actually have on top of this learning. We're making all this progress, but where are we actually going to go? And start planning on what that looks like. And I think when we're thinking about professional development, we should really start applying that lens to it. Yes, it's an opportunity for folks to grow in their organization and their roles and in their capacity, but it's also a way in which the organization can become stronger, the company can become stronger, and we can start really building a strong employee foundation that all share the content knowledge necessary to challenge the boundaries.
And Kelly, you might have had some words to transition us to Q&A, so I'll turn it to you.
Thank you guys so much. That was very rich in terms of content, but also lots and lots of examples. And so I love that. Thank you so much. And yeah, this is open time now for everybody that is on the call. And so feel free to pop a question in the chat if you have a question, or you can also just come off camera or come on camera and unmute yourself and ask a question. So is there anyone that wants to start us off from a Q&A perspective?
I'll start. Hi, my name is Andrea. I have a question pertaining to, well, I guess if either of you have any reflections on how to apply this work into like a virtual workspace as we have transitioned, I think, post-pandemic or current pandemic, like the work cultures have shifted and a lot of them have gone virtual. So have you had any like experiences in this regard, or have you noticed any shifts on how to appreciate cultures differently?
That's always a tough one as we're continuing to learn. And I think a good place to start, and thanks for that question, very relevant. I think a good place to start is less about cultures and more about perceptions on how people contribute virtually. Because I think as we shift, and we probably have a lot to learn from cultures that have already been, fully remote. But as we shift, I think we're coming to head with the same pitfalls of, dominant culture. So, those who always feel comfortable being on camera are those who probably heard a little bit better and maybe respected a little bit more. We see a difference we see socioeconomic differences with, how people's backgrounds show up and, what kind of sounds are happening in the background and all of that stuff. So I think, acceptance or, trying to get us to sort of think of people at the same level of value and contribution is a good place to start. And I had another thought swirling, but let me solidify that thought and turn it to Bria to see if she had anything to contribute.
Yeah, no, I think you were spot on. Make sure I wasn't muted. Is it Andrea or is it Andrea? Andrea.
Andrea, yeah.
Thank you, Andrea, for the question. I'm kind of trying to figure that out as well in our virtual workspace. We're also kind of hybrid across the country. And we just sent out a culture survey to ask staff, like, what is it that you need from us in order to feel the most supported in your work? And then kind of just building on from there. I don't know if that's something you've already done or if you plan on implementing, but if you've taken any analysis from those recommendations or suggestions and just start kind of building on that. And then what do they call it? Having stay conversations. I think incorporating questions around like culture and appreciation, specifically cultural appreciation, like combine the two if you can and will, to incorporate those in your stay conversations might be a really great place to start on navigating what might be best for your organization.
Thank you.
Yeah, totally. It's a good question too, because I think we have, one group who's sort of embracing, oh, great, we're like remote and this is where I want to be and how I best contribute. And then we have folks who are sort of holding on to the past where things were in person and they want to go back there. And I have some clients and I'm coaching some, leaders who, are just of a different time and like, that's what's normal for them. And so because of that focus on getting things back to the way that they were, we're spending less time innovating around how do we create connection across cultures within our organization. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. And I think, getting started is where we're at right now. So.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, if anyone else had any ideas too, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, this next question I'll pop to because I think this is really interesting. It came through in the chat from Julia. So they recently surveyed their employees about perceptions of inclusivity at the company. It was voluntary, and therefore they tend to hear from the same people with similar opinions, very pro inclusivity and excited about their efforts. So Julie is curious about those who don't complete the survey and if they feel that the DEI initiatives aren't, quote, for them. How can we ensure we're hearing from diverse voices?
Such a good question. So that is data, like who is not responding. We should be able to know that if we're collecting demographic data, along with those surveys. And so I think it's tempting to like really lean into that positivity because, it is the data, right? But the things left unsaid, I think we should be honest about too across the board. And when we are surveying, and this goes for collecting demographic data to begin with. So, hopefully we're getting beyond, the EEO, the equal opportunity employee sort of requirements, just gender, race, and, veteran, disability. I would encourage organizations to really start to build some trust with their employees so that they're willing to share who they are, but beyond those 4 categories. We want to hear about, LGBTQ+, sexuality, religion, all of those things, so that when we do these surveys, we can get a slice from, those specific demographics. But again, I think no data is, no data from specific groups is data enough. And my hope too, Julia, too, is that, there is an interest in sort of slicing the data by department and by, those demographics like age, whatever it is, to get as most, nuances as possible. So that's, one way I would answer that, but, Bria, I'm sure you have another idea.
Yeah, one thing that I found really helpful is when onboarding folks include some of the questions that I would include in a survey, our culture survey, and their onboarding 30, 60, and 90-day check-ins. That way we're kind of getting the answers as we go. Like, we don't want people to go a whole year, then maybe they start after the first culture survey, so they don't actually get to answer until the next one, before they're telling us that these are things that aren't working for me. And if we get to that year and they are saying these things, they might not include it in the survey. And so I don't want to call it disrupting, but maybe getting ahead of it. That way we can figure out like what it is that's actually happening. And I am 100% with you, Kiara. It has to be all like emphasized and built around trust, because no staff member is going to share their experiences with anyone in the organization if they feel like it could lead to distrust within the organization.
Yeah, Deborah, please, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, if it's all right, I'd love to add something on this. I think I may be the oldest person on your call today. And I'm just thinking about, I think that's a really interesting question that Julia's asked, because it seems to me that a big part of the reason we have such polarity in our country today, in the US, is because there have been a lot of voices that did not go along with all the forward-thinking initiatives that people like me were interested in. And now then they found a champion, and now all of a sudden their voices are being heard, but it's very polarized. And so if we can open the conversations earlier, and one amazing example of this I hope you all are aware of is Daryl Davis. I don't know if you know Daryl Davis's work. He's a jazz musician that has been instrumental in inspiring people to leave the Ku Klux Klan. If you have not listened to or heard his work, make sure you Google him. To Bria's point about building trust, he sits with people and gets to know them. He actually gets to know them as friends and listens to them and hears their side of things and finds ways to bridge the gaps between them. It's fascinating to listen to him. And I think it's really important. Like, my first response to Julia's question was, go to them and ask them, sit and talk with them. If you think that there's people in your organization that are resistant, take them to lunch, get to know them, find out more about why they think the way they do, because they will probably have some good reasons.
Yeah, make it personal. And not everyone's inclined to share in a survey versus, a focus group or a one-on-one conversation. I think that's a really good point.
Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah, thank you for that. We are at the top of the hour, and I think I hopefully we didn't miss any questions, but yeah, I can just say thank you for this time that you spent with us today, and really appreciate seeing folks, really appreciate the work that Kiara and Bria did to prepare for today and to give us such a good session. And I just want to wish you all a lovely rest of your day this Friday and have a lovely weekend. So, bye all. Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming. Nice to see
Thank
some
you.
friends in my network. Take care.
Thank you all.